Then Jove let fly with his thunderbolts, and the ship went round and was filled with fire and brimstone. A black cloud had descended over the vessel, darkening the sea beneath it. The winds struck with such violence that the mast snapped, the rigging collapsed, and the ship spun helplessly upon the waves. Then came the thunderbolt. Fire and sulfurous smoke filled the shattered vessel, and the men were hurled into the churning water, where they disappeared like birds scattered across a storm-blackened sky.
Homer presents this destruction as the judgment of Zeus. But what exactly was he attempting to preserve in this work? Was this merely the poetic description of a violent Mediterranean storm, or could the ancient account contain a distorted memory of something far greater? A darkened sun, an electrically charged atmosphere, burning material descending from above, and oceans thrown into chaos by a cosmological disturbance. In this show, we are going to examine the Odyssey, not as a simple mythological poem, but as a possible record of a world still recovering from a catastrophe known as the Zero Event. On this channel, we have actually discussed quite a bit of Homer and the Iliad. I don't know how many shows we've done, but way more than I ever thought I would ever do in my entire life. Right? The Iliad didn't matter to me as a historian until about 10 years ago. Right? Because when you read something like the Iliad, and of course, by extension, the Odyssey, you know, it's just kind of a crazy story, right? It's like, all right, fine, mythological. We have heroes, villains, gods, all kinds of crazy stuff going on. Everybody in the past was smoking crack, and this is what they came up with, right? Okay, fine, whatever. And that's kind of how you look at things like the Iliad and the Odyssey. But you know, once you start studying catastrophism, once you start looking into the sciences, suddenly these writings or these poems, I guess a poem is a writing, whatever, you know what I mean. Suddenly these stories took on a completely different historical context. So no longer do I look at the Iliad simply as some kind of an epic poem. Now I look at the Iliad as recording actual history by and large, right? And by extension, we would do that with the Odyssey. But for my research purposes, the Iliad has really been the only important poem so far. And the reason why is because the Iliad, the story the Iliad is telling is a direct explanation of the last major catastrophe that Earth ever suffered. Like during the poem of the Iliad, you have all these things going on, but one of the major parts of the backdrop of the poem is the catastrophe, is the Zero Event catastrophe. Right? This is where the final gods in the sky will mess with Earth. This is where you have Mars, the god of war, right? Ares, you know, messing with Athena, Venus. You know, this is the last time these planetary bodies ever play a role in human mythology. And they do play a role in all human mythology around the same time, by the way. It's everybody. But in the Iliad, it's great because when I'm trying to figure out what the hell was going on during the Zero Event and what kind of catastrophes were taking place, the Iliad actually has good data. Right? The Iliad supplies us with some of these eyewitness testimonies. The Odyssey has not factored into anything on this channel so far. And the reason why the Odyssey really hasn't shown up is because the Odyssey, until recently, the Odyssey it wasn't really showing me anything relative to the major catastrophes. If that makes sense. So what I mean by that is when you read the Iliad, there's some major stuff going on, right? We actually have good planetary movements being tracked in that story. Right? We see what the gods are doing, doing things to planet Earth, doing things in the sky, what people are doing to try to avoid all of the stuff that the gods are doing, things like that. Whereas the Odyssey, a lot of that stuff is gone, right? The Odyssey's fantastical stuff is not as crazily based in god mythology as the Iliad is. I don't even know if any of that makes sense. Does that make sense to anybody? Basically, the way I've always looked at it is the Iliad is like packed full of god stuff, crazy action god stuff, right? Whereas the Odyssey is more subdued. It's infinitely more subdued. And because of that, that made it for me, I didn't know how to read it. I didn't know what it was trying to tell us, because the Iliad, if the Iliad is telling us the story of the zero event catastrophe from a certain perspective over there in the maybe Mediterranean, potentially the European area, or maybe this is a Constantinople area, right? We actually don't know where the Iliad takes place. And by extension, we don't know where the Odyssey happens. Right? That's something that people just take for granted. We have no clue. I know that Heinrich Schliemann thinks he found Troy, but of course, that is exactly what Heinrich Schliemann went to go find, and surprise, surprise, he found exactly what he wanted to find. And then when you look into Heinrich Schliemann's archaeological methodologies, he's not exactly on the up and up about a lot of the stuff he's done. In fact, I would argue that he did a lot of damage, not only to the Troy situation, but also other archaeological sites as well, right? He destroyed something by the Parthenon. Anyway, I don't want to get into it, but the main point is that we have no actual scientific evidence that the Troy that he found is the real Troy. Right? You can make a really, really good argument that the Odyssey took place and the Iliad, both poems, take place in other parts of the world. And people do. It's crazy. There's a whole thing to where the Odyssey and the Iliad take place up in Britain, in France. Another one, I think Fominko likes Constantinople, whereas Constantinople is Troy, for example. Anyway, yeah, it's the main point, I guess, out of all of this is that we actually don't know as much about the poems as most people currently believe that we do. And that's just a scientific fact. That's an issue we have. Okay, anyway, so the Iliad, I know I'm just rambling, I know. The Iliad takes us on a pretty good catastrophe-based story. Something to where we can follow the planetary bodies, we can follow their orbits, we can follow their scientific effects that they would have had on Earth when they approached the planet during various times in the poem. So that's great data, and we've covered a lot of that. But the Odyssey, where the hell does the Odyssey fit in all of this? Well, I'm stupid and didn't even think about it until recently, that obviously the Odyssey would be the aftermath of the zero event. And that would make sense why the Odyssey does not have as much crazy god stuff, because the planets are no longer in the sky like they used to be. They're gone. Or they're not gone, but they're drifting away. Right? The last catastrophe is done by the time the Odyssey starts. Ares, Mars, Pallas Athene, Venus, they're drifting away. They're going to their orbital areas. Right? They're well on their way. Remember, the planetary orbits, they shift quickly, right? I know I'm like getting ahead of myself. Okay, so what's the premise of the show today? Anyway, so here's what I want to go over. I want to look at the poem of the Odyssey, and I want to see if we can't pry out from the poem scientific data that would give us some insight into what was going on after the zero event took place. So, for example, we follow Odysseus, right? And Odysseus would be dealing with the aftermath of this catastrophe. So if we read the poem in that context, if we get rid of all the mythological garbage, right? We get rid of, the Cyclops being some weird mutant thing, and Well, we could talk about that. Anyway, you get rid of all the weird supernatural stuff that is generally accepted as how the story is being told. And instead, we interpret the story using science, using cosmology, real cosmology, using plasma physics, and using catastrophism, and using our knowledge that a catastrophe that had just taken place, depending on the story, a few years earlier. If we look at it in that context, then maybe we can actually tease out an entirely different picture of what was going on Earth during this period of time. And this would be essentially, like an eyewitness testimony. Now, before we go further, obviously the two poems definitely seem to be written with a good deal of creative license. Let's put it like that. And I get that. And I acknowledge that. I am not saying that every single line from the Iliad or the Odyssey is going to deliver some kind of great scientific discovery, because we're just reading it wrong if we read it through a mythological perspective. I'm not saying that at all, because the reality is the poems have been translated, retranslated. We're in a situation to where these works have gone through a bit of a blender. And, when they were originally written, it's entirely possible that, the creator, the writer, whoever started it, actually wanted to make an epic poem for fun while using the backdrop of what was happening in real life. Does that make sense? So, for example, what I mean is that if today you wanted to make a fictional story, but set it during World War II, you could create fictional characters, have them go through events like D-Day or whatever, and those events take place, but the characters are fictional, and maybe the problems they have are fictional, stuff like that. So maybe that's kind of what the Iliad is. That's kind of my guess. It's recording real events while simultaneously having fun from a creative perspective. That would be my guess on what the Odyssey and the Iliad are. That's my guess. So I do take that kind of stuff into account. But that doesn't mean that the backdrop doesn't matter, right? When we have Odysseus being zapped, his ship being, in a whirlpool or whatever, that could be a real event. And that event could reflect a real cosmological problem, right? And the aftermath of a catastrophe. I know I'm just going to keep rambling. The aftermath of catastrophes are really important, in my opinion, by the way. I don't think a lot of people truly appreciate how you have to deal with the aftermath of a catastrophe. There's people all over the place who will say, and have no problem saying, that, yes, a massive catastrophe happened here, and that's what changed everything. Okay, well, what happened afterwards? Like, what were the logistics? What were the psychologies? What was truly going on afterwards, right? Were there any reverberations? What was scientifically happening in the area, right? That's where people don't really talk about, because they don't even think to talk about it. But the Odyssey is probably just that. It gives us an insight into that. Okay, I know, I'm babbling. I know. All right, we need to move on. I'm trying to get to the point quick. Okay, so here is the basic rundown. All right, so we have the Iliad essentially describing a catastrophe as it's experienced by armies on the land, right? They're seeing the gods in the sky, fire, thunderbolts, darkness, earthquakes. All of that celestial stuff is going on in the Iliad, and it is affecting planet Earth, right? That is what the Iliad is generally describing. Then we move on to the story of the Odyssey. And this story is now focused on the survivors of that event, right? So it's focused on the surviving soldiers and the surviving fleets of after, the Trojan War and all of that stuff. And so we start to see what they would have been experiencing in the aftermath. Remember, they're just, a major catastrophe hits, and yes, it does a lot of damage, but that doesn't mean it stops the next day. Right? There's still going to be an aftermath. So when we look at something like the Odyssey, we find, the crazy stuff, like abnormal winds, darkened regions, violent seas. You have altered coastlines now because of all of the earthquakes. We have new volcanic zones. And you have all kinds of other dangerous things, like, there's destroyed settlements everywhere. You have all these weird new straits that are dangerous and messed up. So the Odyssey, interestingly enough, in my opinion, really does fit into the survivors of the catastrophe and them dealing with what they have to deal with. Now, before we go further, it's really important to remember that the zero event catastrophe does not destroy the planet. It's nothing like the deluge. It's nothing like the Venus event. Right? The catastrophe ushered in by Mars causes massive earthquakes. It'll mess up coastlines. It messes with the weather. It does stuff like this. It shifts the latitudes of Earth permanently to where we have it today. And it pulls Earth out of its original orbit, and it turns us from a 360-day orbit around the sun to a 365-day orbit around the sun. Right? That's what the stories talk about. What do you want from me? I didn't make it up. So Earth is it goes through some crap, but it's not the end of the world. Civilizations can still keep moving on. And a lot of the damage takes decades, if not centuries, to truly start to kick in. For example, this is where the Sahara Desert will officially start to kick in, right? Because Egypt is moved further south permanently, what was once an area that was relatively temperate and had a decent amount of fresh water left over from Lake Tritonis, which the Venus event had totally destroyed, Egypt is done. It's going to be turned into a desert because now it's the location, it's too hot, latitudinally. Right, so you see things like this, but it's not instant. Right, this is why, if you're wondering why there's still people doing general politics, right? We have Odysseus, trying to go to his wife, stuff like that. It's all very human stuff. It's because the world did not end. Right? A lot of civilizations are screwed, but they don't know they're screwed yet, by and large, in certain areas. And it sounds like this story actually talks about some of those. Okay, so that's where we're at, right? Okay, so what we'll do is let's go over some of the points and let's see how long this lasts. I don't know if we're going to be able to hit every single one, but I figure we talk about it and maybe we'll do like 2 or 3 shows depending on how much information we have, how much I babble and waste our time, because I know our time. Okay. All right, so let's start. Let's just start with a list. I made a list. Let's go over the list. Let's discuss it. And then also, if you guys have anything you want to add in the comments, do it. I don't say that because I care about comments. I say that because I want to know what you actually have to say about this stuff, because that is what helps form the theories. And in fact, if I'm wrong on any of these interpretations, let me know. That's probably the more important aspect of all of this. Not just, interesting data to give me, but to say, hey, you're wrong. Here's why you're wrong. Okay. That's what I also want to hear. Okay. All right. Let's start with the cattle of Helios. All right. So the cattle of Helios might be one of the strongest cosmological episodes in the story. But here, let's go over it and let's see what we have here. In book 12 of the Odyssey, we find what is probably one of the more glaring catastrophic aspects of the poem. Now, book 12 happens to deal with the cattle of Helios. Basically, the story goes something like this. Odysseus and his crew end up landing on the island of Thrinacia. Now, when they land on this island, they end up finding all of this crazy sacred cattle that apparently belongs to the sun god Helios. Now, Odysseus was warned by both Tiresias and Circe that these animals must not be harmed. If the crew can leave them alone, then maybe they'll still get home. But if the crew ends up killing them, then they can expect disaster. So what happens is that there is a giant storm, like an incredibly crazy storm, that will end up trapping all of the men on the island. And of course, their food ends up running out. Now, Odysseus goes away to pray, while another guy named Eurylochus persuades the starving crew to slaughter the cattle. right? He argues that death at sea is preferable to starvation. I don't know if that's true, but whatever. Anyway, so they do that. They kill the cattle, and then some weird things start to happen, right? The hides of the cattle that they killed starts to move weird, and the roasting meat seems to make weird noises. Yes, I realize that this is not catastrophic, but I do want to paint the picture because, believe it or not, this cattle portion will make more sense when we start to talk about the science of the catastrophism that takes place. Anyway, so Helios ends up demanding punishment. He threatens to stop shining on the world if Zeus does not act. Once the crew sails away, Zeus then sends a violent storm and destroys their ship with a thunderbolt. Essentially, every crew member is killed here except for Odysseus. Now we are getting somewhere, though, because now we are talking about gods relative to cosmology. We have Helios, and we have Zeus, and we have electricity. So when we discuss Zeus, what that means is now that the planetary body Jupiter is now part of the story. Now, Jupiter plays a role in the Zero event. Jupiter's there. Jupiter plays a role during the Iliad, right? He's quite prominent, and he's throwing out thunderbolts. Right? So now instead of thinking about some robed god in the sky, now we might potentially have the planet Jupiter in the sky. Really quick, it's important to remember that Jupiter would be very tiny at this point in time. You would probably still be able to make out, it would be very tiny. Maybe you would, I doubt you would be able to see any details like the bands, Jupiter storms. I don't know if you'd be able to see it. It would probably be more of a kind of a brownish dot in the sky. But you would definitely be able to see the thunderbolt that would be released from that planetary body, as it smacks into Ares and stuff like that. Or the Earth, right? Remember, if there's still an electrical connection, regardless of the distance, and the electrical environment of the solar system at that time is still trying to find, its balance, it's potentially possible that Jupiter would lash out at Earth again. And that is described. Anyway, just to kind of set an example of how we're going to look at this. Helios essentially threatens to stop shining upon the living world and instead wants to shine in Hades. What does that mean? Right? That's what he's threatening. Now, Helios is the sun. We all know that. Okay. Or is it? Helios gets weird in Greek mythology because the main question becomes, are the Greeks talking about the sun as we think about it today, or are they referencing Saturn? So this is where things can get a little iffy, but my guess would be that Helios is indeed at this stage the sun, because Saturn's gone. We lost Saturn a while ago, before the Zero event. Saturn doesn't really matter. Zeus is the only major cosmological body now that is a gas giant. Helios is threatening to stop shining, right? And he tells them, I'm gonna go shine in Hades. What does that mean? Well, does it mean that this is where the Earth tilts because they watch the sun now disappear in a different way over the horizon? Right? Is that what's going on? Right? Or is it some kind of obstruction? Is something getting in the way of the sun? So this is where things will get weird, because during the Zero event, all of that stuff going on up in the sky, right? Mars is surrounded by debris of its own, debris of itself after getting its ass kicked by Venus in the Venus event. You would have all kinds of debris up there. So potentially we have to ask ourselves, what are all of the things that could block the sun? If that's the case, is it a chunk of debris that hangs out for a while? Is it because the Earth has now tilted in a new way and they're not used to seeing this? So Helios says, I'm going to go down and shine in Hades. right? It goes down below the horizon in a different way. That interpretation might be accurate. And in fact, I'd probably go more in that direction, to where this is more proof of the Earth being tilted now differently. And I don't know how this would have looked back then, right? I've never seen the Earth tilt. Who knows how crazy this would have been, right? As the Earth now goes down further, the horizon changes, the sun position is going to change. That would be scary, right? Now the sun disappears for a longer period of time. So anyway, Helios threatens to shine down in Hades forever. It doesn't do that though, right? It comes back up. So this is potentially them describing that tilt. All right, so then the next thing we have is that Zeus promises to destroy their ship with a thunderbolt. And we know the planet Jupiter is electrically active. During the time where all of these planetary bodies were closer to one another, and those planetary bodies would be Mars, Earth, Jupiter, sort of Venus, sort of, and other pieces of debris. It's also possible that there are other cosmological stuff going on that I have no idea about. And that's going to be one of our problems, is that if we don't have a modern day reference for something that was up there in the sky back then, I got nothing for you, man. I can't compare it to anything. So some of this stuff might not make sense, not because we're stupid, but because we don't have, accurate representation of whatever that object was back in the day. It's gone. God knows where it went. Now, I'm not saying that happened here, but just want to throw that out in the interest of being fair in this analyzation. Okay, so Zeus promises to destroy their ship with a thunderbolt. All right, so there's electrical discharge. That is standard. That is standard across the planet, where the planet Jupiter is doing electrical discharges. Not a big deal. So, are they still watching Jupiter up in the sky, doing this stuff? And it would make sense. Yes, the planetary bodies are now farther apart, but they're still electrically interacting. And they would see that. All right, so then we get to the strange portents, right? We have the hides appearing to crawl, and the cooked meat produces sounds. What the hell does this mean? Well, this could also be part of the electrical nature of what's going on. I mean, what if, there was an electrical, a strong electrical piece of activity in the area, not even necessarily from Jupiter, but what if they were dealing with some kind of electrical activity, right, in that area that was causing all the popping and the meat to make weird sounds, and it would be moving from the electricity surging through the muscles of the meat? I don't know. I know that's kind of it's not really a stretch, but like I said, we're going to analyze as many points as we can. It's little details like that which are interesting, and which we may not really get a good explanation for, but having the hides and the meat appear to crawl, I mean, we would expect that if you have a high electrical potential in the area, that's zapping the meat and playing with the nerves. All right? You could push back and say, well, why didn't everybody's, heads explode from electricity? I don't know. I don't know what's going on. I don't have that detail. But hey, there it is. All right. Another thing that happens to them is a black cloud will form above the ship. So during this event, there's still going to be cometary debris in the sky. The Earth is still going to be dealing with all kinds of smoke, darkness, etc. It's entirely possible that at some point in time, they just ran into one of the trails of the cometary pieces from the debris field, and we got enveloped with black smoke. Sky became dark for a day or two. Not even that long, maybe just a few hours. Right? But that's what we would expect. If you have that much cosmological garbage in the sky, things like this are going to happen, and sure enough, they talk about it. It's right there. All right, now, the sea beneath the ship becomes dark. What's going on here? It could be any number of catastrophic things. You could still have some kind of electrical stuff happening, dealing with the water. You could have had an underwater earthquake, which would have kicked up a ton of sediment from underneath the ship, right? You're hanging out, all of a sudden you look down and, there's some earthquake under the water, which you can't feel. And then all of a sudden the entire ocean around you just becomes dark from all of the debris, right? Or it could be runoff from some other part of the catastrophe that happened a long way away that was still flowing towards them. There's a lot of different reasons that could cause a situation to where the ocean would go dark, but it's interesting that they mention it at all. Right? Why even have it in the poem? What's the point? You could have had any other kind of effects, but all of these effects so far can be explained by, the leftover events of a catastrophe. All right, so you got that. Now, the next thing that happens is a violent west wind flows through and hits the ship. The wind is so strong that it breaks the masts. Remember, I said earlier, weather changes are going to be huge during a catastrophe. Earth is still reeling on what just happened during the zero event. There could have been any number of causes which would make a brutal wind show up. I mean, it could be anything from a cosmological body entering the atmosphere. It could be some crazy, hurricane-like weather somewhere else, and they're getting a piece of it. Anything. Any kind of effect could do this. Or there could be all kinds of potential catastrophic explanations that would cause this kind of a wind. Now, this wind is obviously rare because the masts don't usually break during wind. So whatever this wind is, it is insane. But what this is showing us is that the ship is dealing with some kind of a catastrophic event, right? We've got the black cloud showing up. We've got the sea turning dark underneath them. We have a massive amount of wind now hitting them. And then, all of a sudden, Zeus's bolt hits the ship. All right, so now we have electricity showing up, smashing into the ship itself. And when it does this, the vessel fills with this sulfurous smoke. Now, this is interesting that we get sulfur. That sulfur is described at all. The reason why it's interesting is because we have other reports in the area, the Mediterranean-ish, Middle Eastern-ish area, of balls of sulfur raining down in certain parts of the land during a cataclysm. So if you're thinking Sodom and Gomorrah, yes. And what's even more interesting, by the way, is you can still go see those sulfur balls all over that area. It's crazy. So sulfur actually quite literally did rain down out of the sky. Modern geologists will tell us that there was some magical volcano somewhere and they don't know where it's at, but they say a volcano did it, stop asking questions. But we actually do have scientific precedents for sulfur raining down from the sky. So is it possible that the same event that wipes out Sodom and Gomorrah is being experienced by Odysseus and his crew during the same period? Or are Sodom and Gomorrah already destroyed during the zero event itself, and Odysseus's crew are just running into some of the aftermath of something that's still up there in space, right? If you still have some sulfur hanging out in space, Earth runs into that cloud of sulfur and other stuff, you would get the sky darkening and you would have sulfur starting to rain down on you, or you would have some kind of a sulfurous effect, right? And during this new event, you would potentially have some kind of electrical activity, and that is what happens. Now, my question would be this. When they say Zeus, hits him with a thunderbolt, do they literally mean that the planet Jupiter hit specifically Odysseus and his ship? Like F you, right? Or are they simply saying, hey, Zeus is ascribed to electricity thunderbolts. We just got hit with a thunderbolt and they're just using Zeus as a descriptor. I personally would go with that. I think they're just describing, right? It was a bigger thunderbolt, and of course, the ship is now a target. It's an electrical target. It has masts. Well, it did have masts, but it has something sticking up, right? It has something for the electricity to connect to. Right? So they're a target. So my guess is that what is happening is that, the Earth, as it's orbiting, runs into some of this debris, whatever this debris field is. I don't know, I don't know what the hell it is. We just know that it has something to do with sulfur. We know that it's still electrically unstable, right? And we know that there's a good enough amount of small particles to create a dark cloud. So, and the more I think about this stuff, there's all kinds of stuff that could really be happening here, even beyond what we're talking about. I mean, the ramifications are actually pretty crazy. We'll just stick to the story because it's all I got. But there would be a lot going on. And it's interesting to see what they describe. So, okay, anyway, so Zeus slaps them with a thunderbolt, or they get hit with electricity during this particular cosmological storm. Now, this storm, is it affecting the entire planet? That's a good question. I don't know. Right? Whatever it is, it doesn't last that long. It's not a 20-year storm or anything like that. It's a pretty quick one, relatively speaking, and it's entirely possible that, a small area of Earth is affected by this particular event. The whole world is probably not experiencing this like they are, right? The rest of the planet probably has other issues they're dealing with, but Odysseus and his crew has to deal with this. Right? It's going to be an isolated event around their area. Okay, so the ship gets hit with lightning. The entire crew is thrown into the sea, and then the winds abruptly reverse. Right, and that drives Odysseus back towards Charybdis. I don't know how to pronounce all this. Don't kill me. But isn't that interesting? All of this stuff, and then all of a sudden, quick reversal of the winds. This is textbook cosmological catastrophism in operation. And that is what's going on. To shift winds like this, something else is going on the planet. The planet is dealing with something else. Right? And this, if this is describing a cosmological event, we would expect something like abrupt wind reversal, right? Because the Earth, I wonder with the Earth being permanently tilted, so I wonder how that messes with the weather, right? And how long it messes with the weather. And how long ago before this event, for example, did the Earth tilt? Was it a year? Was it, I don't know. But it's something to think about. Anyway, so this catastrophe ends up destroying the vessel, right? Screwed. But it's all sounding like very much a cosmologically led catastrophe, right? We have Helios, he threatens to descend to Hades, and the story is simply preserving, hey, look, the sun did something that it does not normally do. The sun went really low below the horizon. The sun disappeared for an extra, few hours, maybe a whole day. I don't know. The thunderbolt, my opinion, is normal lightning, not directly from Zeus, but, from whatever electrical activity is going on. I won't recap all that. You guys get it. But do you see, even this event, right? This event where we're dealing with the cattle and them sailing away, right there, pretty much everything that's happening is them potentially dealing with a cosmological disaster. We are almost at 40 minutes. Okay, let's keep going. We have not done any of the stuff I wanted to do. This will have to be like a 10-parter. Okay, let's move on. You guys get the point. All right, so the next subject we are going to discuss is when they go to the Sumerians and the land without sunlight. All day long, the sails of the seafaring ship remained stretched. Then the sun went down, and all the roads grew dark. She reached the boundaries of deep flowing ocean. There are the people and city of the Cimmerian men, covered in a haze and cloud. Never does the shining sun look down upon them with his rays, not when he travels toward the star-filled heaven, nor when he turns back again from heaven toward the earth. Instead, deadly night is stretched over those wretched mortals. Arriving there, we beached the ship, took out the sheep, and went alongside the stream of the ocean until we reached the place Circe had described. This particular event will take place in Book 11. Yes, we are going backwards. I realize that. I had no plans, okay? Leave me alone. I have no idea what I'm doing. Anyway, so in Book 11, we find Odysseus and his men sailing towards the boundary of the world as has been instructed by Circe. And the reason why they are doing this is because they're supposed to consult the spirit of the dead prophet Tiresias. So after sailing for an entire day or so, his ship will eventually reach the river Oceanus. Now, the way he describes this river is it's basically encircling the entire inhabited earth. It's a very weird, interesting geological puzzle. I don't know if we'll touch base on that too much because that doesn't really have anything to do with catastrophism or, well, I don't know. Anyway, it's just interesting that he mentions that. Anyway, this is basically where the Cimmerians live. Now, once ashore, Odysseus will do his part of the poem. He'll leave the ship, he'll go over to the area that Circe tells him to go to, digs a trench, pours offerings of milk, honey, wine, water, stuff like that, sacrifices animals, and allows the spirits of the dead to approach the blood. And once that happens, he will speak with Tiresias and other dead people. All right, so that's what happens in the poem. But what is going on in this part of the poem? From a story perspective, it makes sense. It's fine, whatever, right? Odysseus is doing what he needs to do to further the story. But what's going on in the backdrop? Right? What is this Cimmerian land? What is happening here? And this is what is going to be important historically. So, really quickly, relative to summoning the dead, doing what Odysseus does, I'll be upfront, I don't have any good explanation as to what he would technically be doing, talking to quote unquote dead figures, relative to any kind of a real historical context. My guess here is that this is literally just story, and the backdrop is what is important. Right, the backdrop, the land of the Cimmerians. This is what's important. It's a place where the sun never really shines. Before we go further, and I guess I should have said something earlier, remember we have to worry about translation issues as well. The poem, it's copies of copies, translations of translations. We do not have the original, by the way, right? There's no such thing as an original Iliad or Odyssey. And it's very highly probable that these poems were written in the early Middle Ages anyway, but I digress on that. But the reason why the translation issue comes up is because the major question here is where is this place geographically? Now, a lot of people will simply place it someplace up north. And that makes sense, right? The further up north you go, you get to an area which is very easily covered and shrouded in mists here and there up there, as well as having an area to where the sun doesn't really shine, right? We get up into the Arctic Circle area, and now we have an entire different situation for when the sun sets and rises. So the description technically could match something like that. However, and the reason why I bring up the translation issue is because It's also entirely possible that the translation is simply supposed to mean simply covered in haze and cloud, and that's it. What I mean by that is that the sun doesn't really shine only because this particular area, regardless of where it is on the planet, is simply, that's the weather pattern there, I guess you could say, right? That's just the environment for right now. For whatever reason, this area is constantly veiled in haze and cloud. So we have there's two interesting problems here, because a lot of researchers do want to send it up north, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But then you have to explain the voyage, right? That's a lot longer of a voyage than just hanging out in the Mediterranean. Of course, if you want to keep it in the Mediterranean, then you have to find an area that is consistently covered, in haze and cloud. So where the hell is that? And this is where things get weird. But regardless, the poem says that this place exists. Okay, so if it is up north, that's easier to explain. However, if you head up north and you run into the Cimmerians, there's not a lot of people really living in the Arctic Circle, but here we find a situation to where the Cimmerians seem to be doing okay, at least, right? They're existing well enough. So is this really an Arctic Circle people? They don't really describe it as, the most frigid, cold area ever experienced. They don't, the poem doesn't do that. Yes, it's cold, but it's not frozen. And when you head up north into the Arctic Circle, things get frozen. It's a different kind of cold, right? So what is going on in this particular part of the poem? What is being recorded historically? Well, we have a couple of options. I mean, we have the northern option. Is it possible that, yes, Odysseus did indeed sail someplace up north, and they are describing a northern people who are still able to live up in the Arctic Circle area because it is still warm enough to live there. What I mean by that is that after the Earth would tilt, things would get cold quick, but it would still take a sec. Like, you might still be able to hang on to your civilization for a little while. So maybe the Cimmerians, they're now living up in a colder environment, and yes, it sucks, but they're still hanging on. And so maybe Homer is talking about the people who are still hanging on in an area to where now the sun never rises or sets. Or it's another area somewhere, and I don't even want to say it's in the Mediterranean, just somewhere, that is so affected by the catastrophe that now this particular area is just shrouded in fog and smoke and haze due to the earlier events. So is that what he's trying to describe here? I don't know. I don't know for sure, but it is interesting that it is in the poem. Now, the other part of the poem dealing with the Cimmerians, of course, is the dead aspect, right? They're near the entrance of the underworld. Generally speaking, as far as I can tell, the underworld generally means, or Hades, generally means below the horizon. It's kind of the way I've been taking it lately. Which is interesting because why is the horizon, if that's what the underworld means, always so prominent in not only stories like this, but in stories all over the planet, mythologies, histories? It's actually very interesting. And it's also interesting to note that the underworld is literally below the horizon in some interpretations of certain mythologies. So why does the horizon matter so much? Well, I would argue that we're talking about the sun, we're talking about the horizon as extraordinarily important because everything has just shifted. Everything is different, and this is all because things are happening in the sky, and now, the horizon has changed. And it's now very much an alien world to everybody. So this particular part of the poem is simply interesting because, they are talking about something in which we don't have a direct reference for in the modern day and age. If you put this particular part of the poem in the Mediterranean Greek area, where is it? I mean, what area in the supposed ancient Grecian times was anything like this? You know, there's nothing like that. It does not exist. And then if you try to cope and you say, well, they went up north, okay, fine. And maybe that's true, right? But that also doesn't mean they started in the Mediterranean. But if they went up north, then what's going on up there, right? I mean, they're very much describing death, suffering, darkness. You know, is this really the leftover echoes of a destroyed people? Now, the Cimmerians are also interesting, or it's interesting that they use the term Cimmerians because there is a real Cimmerian people in existence, right? That will exist after this poem. Your average scholar says that those Cimmerians are not the same as the poem, but I don't know. I disagree. I could easily see the same Cimmerians being talked about here in the Odyssey as being the exact same ones later on in history, right? The people, the Cimmerians who live potentially up in the northern latitudes, you know, they would migrate out of there over time because that area would be not livable. They'd have to get out. And we do see the Cimmerian peoples throughout history generally migrating from a northish area down south. And of course, it kind of spreads out and stuff like that. But anyway, there is a general north to south migration. So if a cataclysm had taken place, we would expect to find the Cimmerians doing exactly what they do. They get out of their original homeland. And this speaks volumes, by the way, towards anybody else who lived up in that northern area as well. So it's funny, if you think about it, technically, some form of Tartaria would have existed up there as well. So for people trying to figure out how Tartaria gets destroyed, you know, this is your answer technically, right? That northern area gets pushed further up north, and you just can't live up there anymore. And so people have to get out of there. And there's a lot more to it than that. And you know, I realize that Tartaria really just references a people, but it gets weird because now I'm talking about Tartarians relative to the Odyssey. But chronologically, this would be the reality. And I guess that's a whole other topic. But anyway, just something to throw in there. But anybody who lived up in those northern areas, they have to migrate out of there. And sure enough, when we look at the recent migrations within the past, let's say 800 to 1,000 years, that's exactly what we find, isn't it? It's fascinating. So maybe the Odyssey is recording the echoes of that right here, right? They're using their potentially fictitious character Odysseus as a framing tool to wander around this particular real life area. All right, so that might be an interesting explanation for what's going on up there when he goes to talk to the Cimmerians. Now, the last part of this section, of course, would deal with talking about the ghost, afterlife stuff. I don't have an explanation for any of that. I don't, my guess is that's just a fictional framing device to get Odysseus up there to simply describe what is going on. So maybe we can discuss that if we can figure it out later. I don't know. I think we have time for one more. Let's do it, because getting through 2 points of me babbling is not enough. Let's at least get to 3. Okay, so let's talk about the Lystrogonians and the abnormal cycles of night and day. So here's kind of the deal. And once again, we're going backwards because this takes place in Book 10. But the Lystrogonians appear shortly after Odysseus' failed return to the island of Aeolus. So after Aeolus refuses to help him a second time, Odysseus and his remaining fleet, they row continuously for like 6 days or something. On the 7th day, they reach Telepolis, the fortified city of the Lystrogonians. Now, before Homer ends up revealing that the inhabitants are cannibalistic giants, he introduces their country with a strange astronomical observation. And I quote, "The outgoings of the night and of the day are close together. So what Homer does is that he explains that like a herdsman bringing his animals back will encounter another herdsman taking a different flock out. So a person who never slept could supposedly earn two wages, one tending cattle and the other tending to sheep, because the daytime and the nighttime working periods, like, they almost overlap. So that's a weird situation, right? There's two weird situations here. We have the weird situation of night and day, and then, of course, we have the cannibalistic giants. The giant part is fascinating. Let's start with that, actually. The reason why the giant part is fascinating is because, like, right now, history and science really does say that it's more than probable that there were living races of giants roaming the planet. And the further you go back, the more of these giants you find. The further you go back, the more sophisticated these giants are. Here in this story, they're cannibalistic. And actually, the cannibalistic aspect of giants is worldwide. The giant part is really weird because everywhere that we look on the planet, when we deal with giants in history, everybody all over this planet matches up. Like, the entire history of giants matches up everywhere. It is the weirdest thing, right? Giants initially start out as really high-level thinking giant humans, and they're a different, like, race. They're not humans. They're not malformed humans. These are literally a different, whatever you want to call it nowadays, species, race, whatever. They're a different animal. They're not a human. Okay, they're not a human. But they start out strong, intelligent, running stuff here and there. And then as history progresses and as catastrophes happen, the giants slowly start to, you could say, devolve almost. The interesting thing with the Zero event and mentioning these giants is that during this point, the giants are already living pretty lowly. I mean, they really are operating on a pure cannibalistic level. So what that tells us is that they're at the end of their cycle of existence, basically. What's going on? Right? So really quick, just so everybody understands, it's very interesting to see that large life forms on this planet have a very difficult time existing because of gravity. Right? We don't have dinosaurs walking around this planet, not because some fake meteor a bajillion years ago hit them. It's because they could not exist in today's gravity. It's not possible. Right? So what this means is that from a scientific perspective, Earth's gravity had to have been different in the past. Now, what's interesting is that this is essentially what is recorded all throughout ancient history. So then what the hell's going on? Basically, the gravity that we live in today is different from what existed 2,000 years ago, and way different than like 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. Right? And that's what seems to be happening. How does the gravity change? Well, during each one of these catastrophes, whenever Earth runs into another planetary body and both bodies are electrically charged, what happens is that Earth gets zapped by those planetary bodies. So Venus is the famous one, right? So Earth and Venus, they zap each other. And when that happens, there is an exchange of electrons. Venus gives Earth electrons. What happens when you get more electrons? Your density increases, your mass increases. What happens with an increased mass? You get more gravity. So the giant race, if it existed, I get that topic is weird. I get it. But from a biological and a historical perspective, we have to acknowledge it. And here it is in the Odyssey. I got to acknowledge it. As Earth's gravity changes from these catastrophes, larger life forms have a more and more difficult time existing. So giant humanoids would have the exact same problem that a dinosaur would have. Now, a giant humanoid is not, 20 feet tall. They're like 10 to 12 feet tall. I know they've been described bigger, but you know what I'm saying. Anyway, so as the gravity changes, it gets worse for them. The zero event has the last exchange of electrons between two planetary bodies, albeit very weak. So what I mean by that is during one of the times that Mars comes close to Earth, there will be a thunderbolt exchanged, or maybe a few. And what's happening? Well, Earth is sapping electrons from Mars. And when that happens, Earth's gravity changes again. Now, this apparently only happens around 1,000 years ago, and it's also important to note that it's not a huge change. It's kind of like the icing on the cake. The Venus event is the huge change. That changes everything, right? The zero event is basically the last nail in the coffin for giants. Right? That is what will take them out ultimately, apparently. So Odysseus runs into these guys. They're already degenerated, right? And the reason why we don't find them today is because they're dead. They can't survive. They died out. And I know maybe they live in caves somewhere and stuff like that, but I know that's a different subject. Anyway, so it's interesting that Odysseus runs into these guys and he sees them in a degenerative state. This is the exact state that everybody else all over the planet describes them in at this period of time as well. If they're still dealing with them. It's on the rarer side right now. But he finds an island full of them. Very interesting. So what this tells me is that chronologically it's lining up with the rest of the planet with respect to this particular catastrophe, and biologically it's lining up with what we should expect to find. Right? Odysseus is not talking to people in South America. South Americans have the same stories. Right? North American Indians, same stories. It is what it is. It's there. It's not me. I'm not making this up. So what it means is that Odysseus is finding and discovering exactly what we would expect him to find and discover if these events had taken place. So from a biological perspective, this is fascinating. Right? This really is a huge chunk of evidence. And of course, the implications for biology and things like that are huge. And that's a whole 10 million other shows. Anyway, so it's interesting that he finds giants. Now, of course, the other aspect relative to catastrophe is the shifting of night and day. So what is going on with that? I think the best mainstream perspective of this particular phenomena is they say Homer is just describing different times where animals are being pastured. Right? He doesn't mean it literally like there's an issue with night and day. And that's fine. Like that, okay, fine, whatever. That's not bad. If you want to go on the mythological side of interpretation, people will tell you that the edge of the ordered world is all messed up, right? Day and night nearly touch. The people resemble giants rather than normal humans. But, everything is unnatural, calm, and enclosed and weird. And, it just gets... That's the mythical side of things, right? But what could be going on from a catastrophe perspective? Like what could be being described relative to the aftermath of the zero event? Well, what if this is basically a memory of people observing abnormal solar cycles after the catastrophe? So if we are dealing with night and day, we are dealing with the sun, right? And so to get this kind of a phenomena going, one of the main things that would have to happen is the sun would have to change its direction. And when people look out, it's rising and setting in a place that it used to not rise and set. Right? Or the sun is now remaining, higher than it used to for longer, or, stays lower below the horizon longer than it used to. Right? So this is fascinating because, once again, if we have the Earth having its orbit shifted and its latitudes shifted as well, we would expect to find people with this exact kind of story. So here it is in the Odyssey. This is literally remembering the time where the sun changed. And that's what would have happened, right? I mean, the Earth literally changed its orbit, not by a big, not by a lot, by 4 or 5 days, but it still changed. So once again, in the Odyssey, we find a remembrance of the aftermath of something we would expect to find. And I guess that's one of the major things that I'm finding incredibly interesting about the Odyssey. I just started finally officially studying it a little bit ago because it was time. It's been long enough. I've ignored it long enough. And it's amazing because the story is literally recounting what the population of the planet in a certain area, were going through, what they were dealing with, what life was like shortly after that cataclysm. Right? And what it shows us also is that humanity was not wiped out. That's also a very important point of all of this. Humanity was not destroyed. Humanity was punched in the balls, but that's it. I mean, humanity carried on. And it also shows us that other things were going on the planet back then that don't exist today. For example, potentially giants. Right? And I know, I'll let you guys go. But check this out. One more thing really quick, and then we'll leave. Relative to the giant thing, interestingly enough, there are stories to where the British Isles were not able to be conquered because there was a race of gigantes living there. That race is wiped out by a cataclysm that after about a time of 10 to 12 years, that's when, basically the Welsh and stuff, they were able to sweep in and start taking that island. They were not able to do anything until those giants were wiped out by a cataclysm. So I wonder if Odysseus actually sailed to Britain. I don't know. It's just interesting. I don't have a chicken in that fight. But it is interesting that you can very easily correlate those things together. And in the fact that he talks about it in this situation, I don't know. Right? Because with the night and day thing, if you're up there in the British Isles, depending on what kind of atmospheric effects you're having, what kind of anyway, yeah, okay, we got to get going. But you see, it's look at how all of this stuff correlates. Like, we can correlate these aspects of the Odyssey into other histories regarding the Zero event. Okay. So I've got more. We need to talk about more because, in my opinion, this is important because the aftermath of the Odyssey is what is going to set up our civilization now. It's going to set up the current world and the way we live. So it's good for us to see what people were doing after the catastrophe, after the Zero event. How were they recovering? Right? We're just focused on a particular area of the planet. This is not the whole world, but still, it's invaluable information. And if we can correlate this stuff with other stories, then, there's the history. Okay, we're done. All right.